So now that you know who I am, so I'll start by saying that I am an SGA, and this is the perspective that I will be speaking from. So being an SGA means that I was born and raised in a cult, and for those of you who are not familiar with that term, I know that you've heard it thrown around. It means that, it means that, oh, that doesn't, yeah, that's, okay. Let me start again. It means that we were born and raised in a cult. We were either born and raised in it or brought it into our formative years. And it doesn't mean that if you join, you're not going to be able to relate to what I'm about to discuss. It just means that my experience differs slightly, by a lot sometimes. So being born and raised comes with a heavy toll of social and identity changes because we missed out on normal social cues and normal social norms that everyone else is exposed to growing up. We had to heavily suppress our own personalities to acclimate to like the ever-changing rules of the cult. And I remember my confusion when Lorna or Carol Giambalvo or pretty much everyone else in this workshop would say, recovery is an individual process. And I had no clue what that meant because I didn't even know what my identity was. I had no notion of individuality because all we have is the cult as a point of reference. We have no point of reference. I chose to talk about my recovery for 3 reasons. After I left my group, I was, as I said, because we have no other point of reference, I was thrown into a world that I knew nothing about, and as I navigated the space, I saw the media and people who have never had this experience focus on, for example, the level surface belief system of the groups way too much. That's all they talk about. And regardless of what the belief system is based on, doesn't matter, or how cookie they can be, because it's just a surface level facade that covers up the real system of control and subjugation that lives underneath that. And that's what I needed to learn about in order to heal, not to focus so much on the belief system. The second reason is that the focus is either on the belief system or on the traumatic stories, which is the most dramatic part of our experience, is our traumatic stories, which is in itself very valid. These stories do need to be told. But people who have not had the aftermath of what happens between the time that you get out and the time that you're okay doesn't even get talked about. And so people who have never had this experience and are hearing our stories think we live happily ever after, or we ride off into the sunset. And so what we hear is like, it's in the past, right? Why are you still talking about this? Aren't you over it yet? And most people just want us to be okay. And while that is a nice thought, it was detrimental to my recovery as I either pretended that all was well for their sake, or I was thinking something must be wrong with me if I'm not over this already. And this can be very isolating socially. And one final reason to talk about my recovery, and this probably is the most important one, has to do with my own expectations as an ex-member of a group when I came to these conferences, when I came to the SGA conferences, and when I came, and even as I was in therapy. And a fellow SGA who was at the conference for the second time said it best, so I'm just gonna quote him. He said, I thought that I was going to come here last year for 1 weekend and I was going to be cured. You guys were going to give me the answer, explain things to me, and I'll go home and be okay for the rest of my life. Yeah. So, and it's understandable because we ex-members come from like a magic land where like guru or leaders wave their wand and chant and fast or quote a holy book and pray our problems away, basically. This was true for me as I expected an immediate cure from these conferences or my therapist, and I demanded answers people here at this conference or the therapists do not have. I got frustrated when I didn't get the immediate relief that I wanted, and I want to be honest and upfront about what it took for me to recover, in hopes that others can understand that this process is not immediate. This does not go away over the course of 1 weekend or a few months or a few years. It's hard work. Sometimes I failed at recovery miserably, and I felt like giving up a lot. And I know I'm selling recovery, right? My point is that this is a long journey, but as it turns out, it is one worth taking. My recovery didn't really begin until my denial phase was over. Looking back on it, I feel that I went through 3 very specific stages. And I'll share what those were as quickly as I can because I don't have a lot of time. But I felt like I went through a victim stage, a survivor stage, and a thriving stage. Sometimes it was very clear when I leveled up or when I unlocked an achievement. And sometimes it felt like areas of my life were stuck in one stage while the rest moved on to the next. So not all areas of my life were in sync. And because of that, they still aren't, by the way. So since not all of them move at the same time, can be frustrating because then I felt like I was always fixing something. Things changed once I started living with a somewhat normal family. I mean, there's no such thing as a normal family, but I will define normal as a family who has never been exposed to a cult. And that was my husband's family. And I was really exposed to what a family's supposed to be really like. And you know, once that happened, I could no longer turn a blind eye to what happened to me or continue to think that I grew up a little twisted but normal. I couldn't say, you know, my group was kind of cultic anymore, and accepting that something happened was the beginning of my recovery, and as I moved to the first stage, which I will call the victim stage. And I debated whether or not to call it the victim stage because I know this is a really triggering word, it's a loaded word for a lot of us, and also because no one wants to admit to being the victim of something. Society in general does not know how to handle victims of anything well. For reference, see Facebook. And in our polarizing black and white world, it was even worse because being a victim meant to be weak, and it also meant to be preyed on aggressively. So it was too vulnerable of a position for me to be in. But I have to say that admitting that I have been the victim of physical, psychological, emotional, and sexual abuse was an enormously healthy step for me. Yes, this happened. Yes, I was a victim. That admission on its own held a lot of power for me. This was the very first seeds of admission, this was the very first seeds of acceptance for me. Coming to terms with the fact that I was victimized opened me up to many realizations about what exactly I'd been through. It was the beginning of the deconstruction of my past and the reconstruction of my future. The pendulum of emotions swung really wide during this stage as they were really, really raw. There was a lot of grief about lost time, family, and friends. The realization that I was very much alone, and for the first time I realized I needed professional help. I started seeking treatment and search for resources about cults, which I cannot stress enough, research about cults. With that realization and the beginnings of the information that I found about cults and how they operate at a surface, below the surface level, also came the need to tell everyone immediately of what I just discovered. And I think a big part of being in a cult, is the idea that we must save and inform everyone of what we just discovered, because this information is so crucial to us, we must tell everyone at once. And my social skills being very stunted at that point only found frustration as I was looking for support from people that didn't understand or were overwhelmed by what I was telling them. Back then, I only thought people just didn't care. But looking back on it, I heavily underestimated the amount of trauma that I went through and how overwhelming it can be to others to hear about it. I can now see that with the help of hindsight that most people are ill-equipped to deal with the amount of trauma what I went through, and that they have their own lives and issues to carry. It wasn't personal, it wasn't that they didn't care, they just didn't know what to do with all the information I was giving them. It had very little relevancy into their lives. Even if they do know about it, how could they possibly help me in a feasible way? It was a task that was beyond them. My expectations were too high of them. I expected them to carry a lot of my emotional baggage for me. I constantly crossed their boundaries. I insta-friended a lot, which means like when you're on a call, you meet somebody, you have a connection, and you unload on each other, like become very quickly, very, I call it insta-friending. I didn't understand why this didn't work on the world outside, and why couldn't it work, and why couldn't I make lasting friendships, and this was also very isolating. I also kept putting myself in situations where I've been victimized. I saw things as though they were happening to me only, and I was being singled out or hurt on purpose, when in fact a lot of it was self-inflicted. I constantly complained and spun my wheels to anyone that listened in real life or in like online forums. And when solutions were presented on a different perspective to what I was complaining about, they either stunned me into silence because I was convinced I had no other choices, or I get angry and I claim that people just didn't understand. Even those that were truly trying to help. I was so self-involved that I didn't have enough perspective or feeling of autonomy. I was like a selfish toddler at this point in my life, trying to make sense of the world, and I surrounded myself with people who saw the world as I did, careening through my life without any sense of agency or responsibility. I didn't own myself or my actions. At around this time, I was graduating from college, and I have no idea how I made it through art school. It's a haze to me. The busyness and structure of school wasn't there anymore once I graduated, and quiet time came knocking. And it brought its friends, nightmares, insomnia, and rumination. My depression at this stage was rampant. I seriously contemplated suicide shortly after graduation. So I began journaling around this time, and it was full of ruminating and horrible thoughts about myself. But I had to get them out somewhere. It was like squeezing the poison out. I battled with myself a lot. The internalizing and done took a heavy toll. I didn't understand back then that I was fighting for my life. My headaches were frequent. I had fevers sometimes. I would get so worked up that I would get a fever. I had anxiety and panic attacks on almost a daily basis. My triggers went off wildly at this point for seemingly no reason. And my ability to focus would go out the window, and I hyper-focus instead on something or someone and take on their issues as my own, just not to deal with me. I would take on too much work, overpromise, and underdeliver. And there was a good reason why this all was happening, and it was because everything I've been taught and all my defenses were being shaken to my literal core. The more I continued therapy, the more that I informed myself about cults. This was a hard, panicked, and lonely stage to be in. I am thankful for the constant, steady, and loving support of my husband then. As I continued therapy, I began to realize that these things had names, and I started building a vocabulary of words to express what the behaviors meant. Again, just build that vocabulary by reading about what the cults are. I understand now that my brain was automatically protecting me from what it perceived as a threat back then, and going to where it was comfortable. So misery, lashing out, and self-punishment was my comfort. And that sounds really bizarre, but it was a system of self-soothing and protection. I did what I could back then with the mechanisms that I had at the time, the coping mechanisms I had at the time, which were not many. How did I get to the next stage? It was a slow process, but once I arrived at the survivor stage, I stomped on my way in. Base queen. It was an exceedingly empowering and kind of intoxicating the first few times that I found out I had agency, that I could in fact have power over my own actions and reactions. This is when the autonomy and realization that I could protect myself started to flourish. There was a lot more journaling and self-questioning. I started to get a glimpse of some of the answers of where these messages came from. I would write out the messages that were repeating like a broken record inside my brain, and I would have a Q&A with myself. Yes, this is the message, but why? Who told you that? Where did you get that from? Shocking my brain by asking myself these questions and writing the conversation on paper physically. The physical act of writing that conversation on paper as well will force me out of that loop. As I held my own hand through the deep brain cave that I was about to enter, I began to find answers that made sense to me in the context of what I've been through. At this point, my husband's family started growing. There was a lot of babies around me. He is the oldest of 7. There's 15 children from the age of 10 till the age of 1 right now. So this exposure helped me realize how physically fragile and depending on my parents I truly was. This helped me understanding both the normal stages of development, as I look at Leona, and gave me the ability to have more empathy towards myself. It changed my perspective as I thought about the physical, emotional, mental, and at times sexual expectations that our parents and the leaders had for us as children that were beyond our means of understanding. For the first time, I started reconnecting with that numb part of me that had cut off my childhood experiences. There was a lot of healthy crying and a lot of healthy anger for the right reasons. I started learning to sit with my feelings without them overwhelming me. The stage was full also of recovery cha-cha. A lot of steps forwards and realizations with a lot of steps backwards. There was a new awareness of what I was doing and why, and I was able to catch those harmful behaviors and bounce back a little faster, so my resiliency was a little bit faster. Where in the victim stage, I've been depressed for years, now it only lasted 6 months. So me. I began to truly forge meaningful relationships and with people who understood where I came from, and I was safe to speak to them about my challenges as an SGA. I began to flourish a little bit more, and glimpses of my true self started revealing themselves. This was also at a time in my life when I started ridding myself of relationships that were toxic. As I found my voice and took ownership of myself, I would not have it. Woo! None of it. I was not having it. But this is also when the pendulum swings the other way. Not as far as in the victim stage, but still a little bit extreme. And this is once I found out about boundaries and protection, I became very inflexible with them. I started cutting people out of my life. It was like, if you're toxic, you're out. And I justified it by convincing myself and others ad nauseum that this person deserved to be cut out, which led to gossiping behind people's back. And I didn't know that at the time, but it was a huge turnoff to a lot of people I knew. While cutting people out effectively kept toxic people out of my life, I also missed out on a lot of potential relationships and opportunities, personal, career, and otherwise, because I was unable to see people's nuances and accept them for who they were. My sense of perfectionism was still high, and I continued to measure others with very high expectations. My sense of outrage at situations that were beyond my control was also staggering. My sense of outrage on behalf of others was also intense. I over-empathized to the point where I would blindly start telling other people how to handle their own business under the guise of boundaries while stomping straight through theirs. While I was discovering my sense of autonomy, I still assumed people didn't have their own. The self-sabotage was also real in this stage. As I moved forward in the survivor stage, I was self-sabotage or self-punish in some manner for having moved forward. For every step forward I took, I needed the comfort of self-punishment, mainly because my anxiety was still so high, was still at such a high level at this point. Self-sabotage became a way to keep myself in check. As a result, a lot of sassy rebelliousness came about. At times even against myself, because I always felt that I had to have a villain in my life to propel me to do the things I wanted to do. I had to justify my wants and needs by having someone deny them to me in some manner. And then I'd rebel and do it anyways. There was a lot of middle finger in the air at this point. Towards the end of this stage, one of the most crucial parts of my healing happened as I started understanding my own personal family history and looking into what really caused my parents to join. Not that it excuses it, but just like looking into that personal history. I'm glad it didn't happen until the end of the stage, because I wouldn't have been able to handle it otherwise. My perspective started to widen far beyond myself, whereas in the victim stage, it was kind of like a toddler throwing a tantrum sometimes. My perspective started to widen as I matured. When did I begin to thrive instead of just survive? Whether it came with maturity, understanding, or stable security, I don't know. I felt myself crossing this line about 5 years ago, as there was a major shift in my life that pushed me into this direction. It didn't feel great at the time, but looking back, it changed everything for me. This stage came with a lot more discovery of identity and acceptance. Acceptance was key. I began to allow myself to do things because I wanted to do them, not because some imaginary person was against me somehow, and I needed to prove myself, my worth, or my existence to anyone. I learned a few really important lessons, and some of them I'm still working on. So I'm not saying, I'm still working on this. One of the biggest lessons I learned at this stage was to give people back ownership of their feelings and issues, giving them credit for their own truth and autonomy. I can listen, I can empathize, sometimes sympathize, but I do not need to take their feelings on, nor do I need to take action on their behalf. Or figure out why they're doing what they're doing, or what their perspective is at times, because I can't assume that I know what their experience has been so far in life. I trust that they can handle their own, and even if they can't, it's not up to me to rescue them, and it's not up to me to fix them. My help can only take them so far. They have to carry their own. I will not carry anyone's burden for them. I learned to draw a clear line of identity. This is me and this is them. I learned to see people as individuals with their own mind and perspective, rather than the robots who parroted the guru that had assigned roles that I grew up with. So I grew up with people who had assigned roles. Now I started to see people more rounded way. This may seem like a given, and it is for people who grow up outside of cults, but it was a lesson that helped me flourish. At the same time, it also allowed me in turn to see the worth that my own experiences and what my perspective brings. It is a give and take style of relationship rather than just giving or just taking. Another refreshing state of thriving is facing challenges knowing that there will be a solution and that I'm perfectly capable of handling whatever comes my way, even if things fall apart, and they will. I don't have a sense of fatality or doom anymore. It's not the end of everything when something goes wrong. It doesn't mean the cult was right or my parents were right. It just means terrible things happen, and I will get up and rebuild. Should I need help, I know I can find it. I have a wealth of resources and choices. I have built by now a great support system that I use often, and I cannot stress enough, please, support system. Building a support system is key. Sorry, it's key. It took me years to find my people, and I'm thankful for having them in my life. I knew I was thriving when I began to let go of the identity of just being an ex-cult member and began seeing myself as a well-rounded whole person with more to life than the experience that I've had. Yes, this happened to me, but as I live on, it becomes a smaller and smaller part of the larger tapestry of my life. I'm much more than just this experience. This is not the only thing that defines me. This realization came about by learning how time works outside of cults. The pace of the outside is much different than the one that when we were inside. When we were inside, there was no time. Everything was urgent. There was no sense of future out here. There's a sense now of planning for the future because there will be one. And I know that's mind-blowing, but it was a mind-blowing premise to adjust to. The last few things that I'd say that helped me along, I found myself stuck in places because I didn't have a healthy behavior to replace the unhealthy one with. So I can no longer beat myself up. What do I do instead? Like what's the norm? Paying attention to how healthier people around me handle themselves in a healthier ways helped me replace the old behaviors with something new. So people who are like out in the world, how do they handle it? It took practice and it felt really wrong at first. To try something that's healthier is always going to feel wrong. There's an adjustment period for that. But it also required surrounding myself with healthier people. I also had a few terrible things happen in my life. My apartment building burned down about almost 8 years ago. And I was misdiagnosed with fibromyalgia. I was in chronic pain for 6 years. When these things happened, I had many moments where I completely reverted back to, all the way back to, if I hadn't left the group, this would have never happened. I had to be kinder and more patient with myself in these situations. Self-compassion. This is when a good therapist and a really good support system matters. I cannot stress how important it is to not isolate in these instances. My first instinct was to retreat and isolate. I had to force myself out of my brain cave and ask for help when I needed it. Building a support system within this community was vital for my recovery. Having an amazing therapist within this community that understands our perspective, especially for SGAs, literally saved my life. Journaling was essential for me, and I know that this can be triggering for other people in other groups, but for me it was essential. Recovery can be overwhelming, and at times I have made a lot of progress, and at times I got stuck in a rut for years. I gave myself breaks. I had to take a break every once in a while. Allowing myself to acknowledge my victories when I could and celebrating them with friends. Friends that knew why that was a victory. And that has been crucial for me, not just the fact that I had a victory, but also like friends, that knew why that was a victory. And finally, reading as many articles and books as I could find that were helpful, whether they were fiction, non-fiction books, psychology books. I've read quite a few, and this is like a short list. Whatever was helpful for me to move forward at the time. I had a non-fiction book that we stuck. I had a non-fiction book that really explained some things to me about my parents growing up in a dictatorship. So you'll be surprised. I wish I could wave a magic wand and tell you exactly what to do, what your hurdles would be, and what to avoid. I wish I could tell you that it's not that hard, or it doesn't hurt, or you will ride off until the sunset. But I can only say that at the end of the day, recovery is an individual process. I've not told you the journey of my recovery as a solution. Please, by no means is this a path or a way, okay? I've not told the journey of this as a solution, but rather as an open personal journey that I chose to make public in the hopes that it demystifies the process and gets rid of the should be. You are exactly where you should be in your own recovery. It is my hope that by hearing my journey, you will find your own. Wow. Thank you.